People think steel fails because it's weak. It fails because it was asked to pretend. Out here, a hairline crack is a warning. In a room, it's a habit. This break didn't happen all at once. It took its time, quietly, until the day the metal had nothing left to give. If you're waiting for a loud warning, you'll miss the real one. People think metal fails in a moment. It doesn't. It practices, quietly, until you finally give it permission. People think steel fails when it's weak. It fails when it's surprised. Temperature drops, the crystal structure stiffens, and suddenly a safe part forgets how to bend. Watch the frost line. That's not decoration, it's a warning. If you want... I can't give you the hour, sir. Only the sound, like metal deciding. If you write it down clean enough, it'll look like truth. People think ships fail with engineers scream. Most of the time it's quieter than that. Just one decision made a millimeter too thin. And the ocean, it's very patient. People think metals fail when they're old. Most of the time, they fail when they're misunderstood. You can polish a surface until it look perfect, one careless heat, one rushed weld, and the crack starts where... People think steel is strong because it doesn't bend, but it's the bending that tells the truth. So if you're carrying a crack you can't name, good. It means you're still under load, and you're still